Clang, clang, clang. The rhythmic sound of iron hammers striking heavy timber tore through the morning fog, echoing for 200 kilometers along the Via Appia. It was 71 BCE, and the most famous road in the ancient world was no longer a bustling artery of trade. It had become a monument to terror. 6,000 men hung dying on wooden crosses, their ragged breathing mixing with the sweet scent of Italian pines and the copper tang of blood. This was the ruthless answer of the Senate to the question of rebellion. At the very moment the Roman Republic was dismantling mighty empires in the east and breaking the tribes of Spain, its own heart almost stopped beating because of 70 kitchen knives and one Thracian slave. Or how did a desperate escape from a gladiator school evolve into a military crisis that annihilated consular legions and forced Rome to crucify 6,000 human beings just to restore order? Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we walk the blood-soaked path of the Third Servile War. The conflict that proved Rome's greatest enemy was the very foundation it was built upon. But before the crosses stretched to the horizon, there was only a cramped training ground in Capua, and a plan so desperate it should have been impossible. In the sweltering heat of Capua, during the summer of 73 BCE, the school of Lentulus Batiatus was not a place of honor. It was a factory of death. Here, 200 men, mostly Thracians and Gauls, lived in a state of suffocating claustrophobia, training daily to kill each other for the amusement of the mob. A conspiracy to escape had been whispering through the cells for weeks, but, as is often the case in the desperate dark of a prison, the plan was betrayed. The guards were alerted, the armory was locked down, and the heavy iron gates began to close. For the conspirators, the choice was binary: immediate execution or a suicidal charge. 78 men chose the latter. Cut off from their swords and shields, they stormed the only room left unlocked: the kitchen. What followed was a spectacle of raw butchering violence. Snatching up heavy meat cleavers and roasting spits, they fought their way out of the compound, hacking through the guards with tools meant for slaughtering livestock. It was messy, brutal, and loud. The sound of iron spits clanging against Roman mail echoed through the streets of Capua. As they burst out of the city, a fate handed them a lifeline that would change history. They intercepted a wagon convoy transporting legitimate gladiatorial weapons to another city. In minutes, the fugitives traded their kitchen knives for the gladius and the heavy scutum. They were no longer just runaway slaves. They were a heavy infantry unit, hardened by years of brutal discipline. They elected 3 leaders: 2 Celts, Crixus and Oenomaus, and a Thracian named Spartacus, a man who, according to Plutarch, possessed not only great strength, but also a superior intelligence and culture, perhaps suggesting he had once served as an auxiliary in the Roman legions. They did not flee into the obscure countryside to hide. They marched. But they had escaped the cage only to find themselves trapped in the heart of Italy, surrounded by a hostile population. And Rome, still believing this was merely a local riot, sent a wolf to catch what they thought were stray dogs. The Senate, annoyed but not fully alarmed, dispatched Praetor Claudius Glaber with a force of 3,000 men to crush the disturbance. It is crucial to understand the nature of this force. These were not the iron-disciplined legionaries who had conquered the Mediterranean. Those veterans were deployed far away in Spain and the East. Glaber commanded a hastily conscripted militia, swept up from the streets and fields, a police force sent to quell a riot, not an army equipped for war. Glaber, embodying the lethal arrogance of the Roman aristocracy, marched south and easily cornered the rebels atop the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The geography formed a perfect natural prison. Vesuvius, at that time, a dormant, overgrown mountain, possessed only one narrow, treacherous path leading up to the crater rim where the gladiators had taken refuge. Glaber seized this choke point, establishing a fortified camp at the base. He did not order an assault. He simply waited. His strategy was one of passive containment. Hunger and thirst would do the work of swords. The Romans sat by their fires, joking about the kitchen army trapped above, completely unaware that the terrain itself offered a weapon they had deemed impossible. On the precipice, Spartacus looked not at the blocked path, but at the sheer vertical cliffs that the Romans had left unguarded because they were considered unclimbable. The slopes were thick with wild vines. In a feat of desperate engineering, the rebels cut these vines and twisted them into long, sturdy ladders in the dead of night, and with the wind masking the sound of wood scraping against stone, the gladiators descended the cliff face one by one. The silence was their armor. They reached the bottom not as a disorganized mob, but as a tactical unit. Instead of fleeing into the darkness, they circled the base of the mountain and struck Glaber's camp from the undefended rear. The psychological shock was absolute. The Romans, expecting starving slaves to beg for mercy at dawn, awoke to the terrifying reality of gladiators, men trained specifically to kill in close quarters, slaughtering them in their tents. Glaber fled in disgrace, leaving his camp, his supplies, and his weapons to the enemy. Glaber was humiliated, but his defeat turned a local riot into a national nightmare. Now the shepherds were listening. The victory at Vesuvius sent a shockwave through the Italian peninsula that was far more dangerous than the military defeat itself. It broke the psychological chains of the oppressed. From the latifundia, the massive slave-run plantations of the south, thousands of shepherds and herdsmen flocked to Spartacus's banner. These were not the urban servants of the city households. These were men who spent their lives fighting wolves and bears in the rugged Apennines, hardy, brutal, and accustomed to sleeping on the cold earth. The rebel force swelled rapidly from a small band to a staggering mass of 70,000 souls. It was no longer a simple warband. It was a migrating nation, a chaotic city on the move, dragging with it women, children, and the elderly who had nowhere else to go. Yet, this hydra was a logistical nightmare. The camp was a cacophony of conflicting tongues, Thracian, Gaulish, and Germanic dialects, clashing with the Latin of the escaped Italian farmhands. They had no supply lines, no armories, and no foreign allies. In the flickering light of their campfires, rebel smiths worked tirelessly, melting down the very iron fetters that had once bound their wrists to forge crude swords and spearheads. Hides from slaughtered cattle were stretched over wicker frames to create shields. In stark contrast, Rome finally treated this tumult with the gravity of a foreign invasion. The Senate, stripping away the pretense of a mere police action, dispatched both consuls of the Republic, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, each commanding 2 full legions. The eagle had fully awakened. The Roman machine was uniform, almost silent in its discipline, and terrifyingly efficient. Against them stood a force that was massive but fatally divided. While Spartacus, possessing the strategic mind of a general, understood that they could not defeat the infinite manpower of Rome indefinitely and must escape over the Alps to freedom. His lieutenants saw a different path. Crixus, the Gaul, intoxicated by the early victories, looked at the burning villas and saw only plunder and immediate revenge. He did not want to leave Italy. He wanted to bleed it dry. This internal fracture was the crack in the armor that the consuls were waiting for. The army was massive, but it had 2 heads, and Rome knew exactly how to sever one. The separation of Crixus was not just a tactical error, It was a death sentence, written in hubris, one while Spartacus drove the main body of the rebellion north toward the Alps and freedom. Crixus and his contingent of Gauls and Germans chose to linger in the rich lands of Apulia, drunk on the wine of easy victories. They wanted war, and Rome gave it to them. Consul Lucius Gellius Publicola descended upon them near Mount Garganus with the full weight of the Republic. The battle was a massacre. Without the strategic mind of Spartacus to guide them, the rebel ferocity shattered against the disciplined shield walls of the legions. Crixus, the man who had first broken the chains in Capua, fell fighting in the front lines, and 20,000 of his followers were slaughtered where they stood. News of the disaster reached Spartacus quickly, but instead of despair, it ignited a cold, calculated fury. He was trapped between two consular armies, Gellius behind him and Lentulus blocking the road ahead. In a display of generalship that rivaled Hannibal, Spartacus did not flee. He turned and struck Lentulus first, shattering his legions in a lightning assault, then swung his army around to crush the pursuing forces of Gellius. In a single campaign season, a former gladiator had dismantled the military might of the two highest magistrates in Rome. The road to the Alps was open, but Spartacus paused to perform a ritual that would haunt the Roman psyche for generations. To honor the shade of Crixus, Spartacus ordered the capture of 300 Roman prisoners, men of rank, centurions, and legionaries. He did not execute them. He humiliated them. In a makeshift arena constructed from the baggage trains, he forced these proud soldiers of the Republic to take up swords and fight each other to the death. The roles were reversed in a terrifying piece of theater. The slaves sat in the high seats, roaring and betting on the lives of their former masters, while the Romans were forced to bleed for the entertainment of those they deemed property. The dust of the arena turned to mud with Roman blood, and the cheers of the rebel army signaled that this was no longer a revolt for freedom, but a war of vengeance. The humiliation was absolute. Rome had no generals left to send, so they turned to the richest man in history and the darkest ancient law. With the consuls humiliated, the Senate House was paralyzed by fear. No aristocrat wanted the command. The name Spartacus had become a curse that ended political careers. Into this vacuum stepped Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. To Crassus, this war was not about glory. It was a liquidation of a bad asset. He did not ask the Senate for soldiers. Instead, he opened his own vast treasury and raised 6 fresh legions, nearly 30,000 men, paid for, equipped, and owned effectively by him. His first move was to send his legate, Mummius, with 2 legions to shadow the rebels. The orders were explicit: observe, harass, but do not engage. But Mummius, hungry for the glory that had eluded his superiors, saw what he thought was a vulnerable flank and ordered a charge. It was a catastrophe. Spartacus wheeled his battle-hardened veterans around and shattered the Roman lines. The legionaries, terrified by the ferocity of the former slaves, broke formation. Hundreds died, but worse, thousands fled, and throwing away their shields and swords, the ultimate act of cowardice in the Roman military code. When the survivors stumbled back to camp, they did not find refuge. They found a monster. Crassus did not scream. He simply ordered the revival of an ancient, terrifying punishment that had not been used in generations: decimation. He assembled the 500 men who had led the rout. They were divided into groups of 10. In a silence heavier than any battle roar, lots were drawn. One man from each group, regardless of rank or guilt, was selected to die. The horror lay in the executioners. Crassus forced the other 9 men in the group to pick up heavy wooden clubs and beat their unlucky comrade to death. The camp filled with the sickening crunch of wood on bone, and the screams of men being bludgeoned by their own tentmates, and the rest of the army watched in petrified silence. By the time the sun set, 50 corpses lay in the dust, but the lesson was burned into every surviving mind. Crassus had rewired the psychology of the legion. From that day forward, his soldiers learned a simple, brutal truth. They must fear their general more than they feared the enemy. With the wolf now leading the pack, Spartacus was pushed south, straight into a trap made of water and walls. Spartacus marched his people to the very edge of the Italian peninsula, the rugged toe of the boot at Rhegium, gazing across the narrow strait toward the tantalizing silhouette of Sicily. His plan was sound: cross the water, ignite a new slave revolt on the island, and cut off Rome's grain supply. He had struck a deal with Cilician pirates, the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean underworld, paying them with the accumulated plunder of 2 years. But honor among thieves is a myth. The pirates took the treasure, hoisted their sails, and vanished into the mist, leaving the rebel army stranded on the beach. Spartacus was now backed against the churning gray water of the winter sea, with nowhere to go but back. And waiting for him was Marcus Crassus, who had arrived not with swords drawn, but with shovels. Crassus, ever the pragmatist, understood that hunger kills faster than legions. He ordered his men to construct a fortification that defied belief, a continuous line of circumvallation stretching 55 kilometers across the entire neck of the peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea. It was a feat of military engineering that only Rome could execute. A day and night, the rebels heard the rhythmic thud of Roman pickaxes and the crashing of timber. Within weeks, a ditch 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep scarred the earth, backed by a wall of stone and wood palisades. It was a prison without a roof. Inside this trap, the geography of death took hold. The land was stripped bare of every scrap of food. Cattle were slaughtered, then the cavalry horses, and finally, men were boiling their leather belts for soup. The biting wind of the coast howled through the camp, carrying the stench of starvation and despair. Crassus sat comfortably on the other side, waiting for the slave army to dissolve into skeletons. They were starving. They were trapped. But on a snowy night, Spartacus proved that a desperate beast is the most dangerous. Under the cover of a blinding winter storm, and the impossible happened. Spartacus ordered his starving men to fill a section of the massive Roman ditch, not just with earth and timber, but with the frozen carcasses of their own dead and the rubble of their camp. Over this macabre bridge, a third of the rebel army surged out of the trap, breaking the containment line. Crassus was horrified. The wolf had escaped again. But the strategic clock was ticking against both commanders. News arrived that Pompey the Great was marching from Spain with fresh legions, and Lucullus had landed in Brundisium. The Senate, losing patience, was ready to hand the war to Pompey. For Crassus, this was a nightmare. If Pompey arrived, Crassus would become a mere footnote in history. He had to force a decisive battle immediately. The two armies met near the Siler River in Lucania. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of finality. Before the lines engaged, Spartacus's squires brought him his horse. In full view of his exhausted army and the shimmering Roman ranks, the Thracian drew his gladius and drove it into the beast's neck, killing it instantly. As the animal collapsed, he shouted to his men, "If we win, I shall have a great many horses from the enemy. If we lose, I shall have no need of one." It was the ultimate statement of commitment. There would be no retreat, no maneuvering, no escape. The battle began with a deafening crash of shields, but Spartacus did not direct it from the rear. He knew that his ragged, starving force could not beat the heavy infantry of Rome in a prolonged grind. His only chance was to decapitate the snake. Spotting Crassus's command retinue behind the lines, Spartacus charged. All with a small knot of his fiercest veterans, he carved a bloody path straight through the center of the Roman formation. Historical accounts describe a man possessed. He cut down 2 Roman centurions who tried to block his path, ignoring the rain of javelins and arrows. He got within sight of Crassus, but the sheer weight of the Roman numbers was too great. A spear drove into his thigh, shattering the bone. Even then, the legend refused to die. Falling to one knee, holding his shield high, Spartacus continued to fight, hacking at the wall of legionaries closing in on him. He was not fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting for a good death. Finally, the wave of iron crashed over him. He was hacked to pieces on the muddy bank of the Siler, disappearing so completely into the carnage that his body was never identified. Spartacus fell, his body lost under a mountain of corpses. But for Crassus, the war wasn't over until the message was sent. The battle at the Siler River was over, but the dying had just begun. While Crassus had broken the back of the revolt, he was denied the total glory he craved. Pompey the Great, marching down from the north like a vulture, intercepted 5,000 fleeing rebels who had escaped the slaughter. He cut them down effortlessly and wrote to the Senate, "Crassus conquered the slaves, but I have extinguished the war." It was a bitter political sting that would poison the relationship between the 2 most powerful men in Rome, eventually setting the stage for the collapse of the Republic itself. But Crassus, cold and calculating to the end, ensured his mark would not be forgotten. He took the 6,000 surviving prisoners, men who had fought for freedom, and turned them into a grim warning. Along the entire length of the Appian Way, from the gates of Capua to the walls of Rome, a forest of timber rose. Every 40 meters, a man was nailed to a cross. They were not allowed to die quickly. They were left to rot, to thirst, and to be pecked by birds, while the traffic of the empire passed beneath their dying groans. For months, travelers walking to the capital had to pass through a corridor of stench and agony. It was the brutal restoration of Roman order. The Third Servile War changed the state forever. The wealthy landowners, terrified of another uprising, began to shift away from massive slave gangs, slowly paving the way for the tenant farming systems of the future. The ghost of Spartacus never truly vanished. He became the nightmare that kept Roman masters awake at night for centuries. The revolt proved that the empire could crush any army, but it could never fully extinguish the terror of those they oppressed. If you want to join us as we uncover more heroic chapters of history, please subscribe to our channel